The night is heavy, the kind that presses against your chest, thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a flare arcs across the sky, its fleeting glow illuminating the jagged silhouette of a shattered city. Bakhmut, Ukraine, 2022. A place where time feels suspended, where every breath carries the weight of survival. In the stillness, a faint sound cuts through, the soft crunch of boots on gravel. A young soldier, barely visible in the moonlight, crouches behind a crumbling wall. His breath is shallow, his hands trembling as they grip a worn rifle. His name is Mykola, and in his eyes there's a flicker of something. Fear, resolve, or perhaps a memory of home. The air hums with tension. A low rumble grows, like the pulse of an approaching storm. Then, a sharp crack splits the silence, a single shot from somewhere in the dark. Mykola flattens himself against the wall, heart pounding, as voices shout in a language he knows too well. The enemy is close, too close. His fingers tighten around a small, folded photograph tucked inside his jacket. A picture of his sister, smiling under a summer sky. He whispers her name, a quiet prayer against the chaos. What brought him here, to this moment, where every second feels like a borrowed gift? How does a man hold on to hope when the world around him burns? The story begins days earlier, in the quiet before the storm, when Mykola and his unit prepared for a mission that would test the limits of courage. The weight of the land. Context. The city of Bakhmut, nestled in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, stood as a scarred monument to endurance in the autumn of 2022. Once a quiet hub of salt mines and modest homes, its streets now lay fractured, pocked with craters and draped in the dust of relentless conflict. The surrounding landscape stretched flat and open, interrupted only by patches of skeletal trees and the occasional rise of low hills, offering little cover for those who tread its paths. The Donets River, sluggish and grey, wound nearby, its banks churned into mud by the passage of boots and machines. Autumn had settled in, bringing a biting chill that seeped through uniforms and clung to the skin. Rain came often, turning the ground into a slick mire that sucked at every step, while fog hung low in the mornings, shrouding the world in an eerie half-light. The conflict in Bakhmut had grown into a grueling test of wills. Two forces, one Ukrainian, the other Russian-backed, faced each other across a fractured urban maze. The Ukrainians, under the command of seasoned leaders like Alexander Siersky, held defensive lines in the city's eastern districts, their positions a patchwork of basements, ruined apartments, and makeshift barricades. Their adversaries, including the Wagner Group, pressed from the outskirts, their movements methodical, probing for weaknesses. Both sides were stretched thin, their resources strained by months of attrition. Artillery thundered day and night, its rhythm as constant as a heartbeat, while drones buzzed overhead, their hum a reminder of eyes in the sky. The broader world watched, its attention flickering. News of distant summits and diplomatic murmurs reached the soldiers only as faint echoes, drowned out by the immediate demands of survival. The weather, too, was a silent adversary. Rain-soaked gear grew heavy, and the cold gnawed at fingers fumbling with equipment. For the Ukrainians, Bakhmut was more than a city. It was a symbol of resolve, a place where every meter held was a testament to their refusal to yield. For their opponents, it was a prize to be claimed, a step toward broader ambitions. Neither side spoke of victory in grand terms. Here, it was about holding ground, about enduring one more day. Mykola's unit, a mix of veterans and young recruits, was tasked with reinforcing a critical position on the city's eastern edge. Their orders were simple but daunting. Hold the line, protect a narrow street that served as a lifeline for supplies. The men knew the odds. They had seen the maps, the red lines creeping closer, the reports of dwindling ammunition, yet they also knew the weight of what they carried. Not just rifles and rations, but the hopes of those back home, the memory of a country unbroken. As they prepared to move out, the air was thick with unspoken questions. How long could they hold? What would it cost? And in the quiet moments, as the rain fell and the wind carried the distant rumble of shells, each man grappled with his own reasons for being there. Faces in the dust. Characters. Mykola Hrytsenko was 23, with a lean frame hardened by months of carrying gear through mud and rubble. Born in a small village near Cherkasy, where fields of wheat stretched golden under wide skies, he had grown up tending to his family's garden and dreaming of studying engineering in Kiev. His hands, once stained with soil and engine grease, now bore the calluses of war. Mykola had enlisted in early 2022, driven not by grand ideals but by a quiet sense of duty. His younger sister, Olena, still lived in their village, and he could not bear the thought of her world unraveling. The photograph he carried, creased and faded, showed her laughing at a harvest festival, her braid swinging as she danced. It was his anchor, a reminder of why he endured. Mykola's inner world was a tangle of resolve and doubt. At night, when the camp was quiet, he would lie awake, tracing memories of his mother's borscht, the creak of his father's old bicycle, the hum of summer evenings. Fear was a constant companion, not of death itself, but of failing those he loved. Yet there was a stubborn hope in him, a belief that each day he held the line was a day closer to Olena's safety. He rarely spoke of it, but his dark eyes, sharp and searching, betrayed a mind always weighing the cost of survival. Beside Mykola was Serhii, a wiry medic from Lviv, whose quick laugh and quicker hands had saved more lives than he could count. At 30, Serhii was older than most in the unit, a former paramedic who had traded city ambulances for battlefield stretchers. His wife and infant son were his reason for fighting, though he kept their photos hidden, afraid that seeing them too often would weaken his resolve. Serhii's humor masked a gnawing guilt. He wondered if every life he saved balanced the ones he couldn't. In quiet moments, he'd hum folk songs, his voice soft but steady, a thread of comfort for the others. Then there was Irina, the unit's radio operator, a 20-year-old from Odessa with a sharp tongue and sharper instincts. She had joined to honor her brother, killed in the war's early days, and her fierce determination made her a steady presence. Irina's dreams were of the sea, of returning to Odessa's beaches with her sketchbook, capturing waves in charcoal. She hid her fear behind brisk efficiency, but at night she'd clutch her radio like a lifeline, whispering coordinates as if they could tether her to home. Together, they were a small family, bound by shared burdens. Mykola admired Serhii's calm under pressure, relied on Irina's quick thinking. They teased each other over cold rations, shared stories of home, and silently carried the weight of what lay ahead. Each had their reasons: love, loss, duty, but all shared a quiet vow: to hold the line, not just for Bakhmut, but for the lives waiting beyond the horizon. March through the mist. Movement. The morning was cloaked in fog, a grey veil that softened the edges of Bakhmut's broken streets. Mykola's unit moved out at dawn, their boots sinking into the mud as they navigated the outskirts of the city. The air was damp, carrying the sharp tang of wet earth and the faint, acrid bite of distant smoke. Their destination was a cluster of shattered buildings on the eastern edge, a crumbling outpost they were tasked with reinforcing. The street they were to hold was narrow, lined with skeletal remains of shops and homes, its cobblestones churned into a slurry by weeks of rain and shelling. It was a lifeline for supplies, a fragile thread connecting their forces to the rear. Losing it would choke their defenses. Mykola walked near the front, his rifle slung across his chest, the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders. The fog muffled sound, but every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent his pulse racing. He glanced at Serhiy, who trudged beside him, his medic's bag slung low, his eyes scanning the ground as if reading it for signs of danger. Irina was a few paces behind, her radio crackling faintly, her fingers adjusting dials with practiced ease. The unit moved in a loose column, 12 men and women, their faces taut with focus. Their commander, a grizzled captain named Taras, led with quiet gestures, his hand signals cutting through the haze. The journey was slow, deliberate. The terrain was treacherous. Craters pocked the road, some filled with murky water that reflected the pale sky. A burned-out vehicle, its frame twisted like a discarded toy, loomed out of the fog, a reminder of the stakes. Mykola's breath fogged in the chill, his thoughts drifting to his sister's voice, her laughter over the phone the last time they spoke. He pushed the memory down, focusing on the rhythm of his steps, the soft clink of gear, the low hum of Irina's radio. As they neared the city, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the distant thud of artillery. The fog began to lift, revealing Bakhmut's scars, walls pocked with bullet holes, windows like empty eyes, a child's bicycle half buried in rubble. The unit paused at a crossroads, crouching behind a low wall. Taras scanned the horizon with binoculars, his jaw tight. "Drones," he muttered, pointing to faint specks in the sky. The group pressed closer to the ground, their breathing shallow, waiting for the hum to fade. In that moment of stillness, Mykola felt a fleeting calm. A single bird, small and grey, flitted across the road, landing on a broken lamppost. Its chirp was sharp, defiant, a sliver of life in the desolation. Serhiy caught Mykola's eye and grinned faintly, whispering, "Even the birds don't give up." Irina, overhearing, rolled her eyes but smiled, her fingers still on the radio. The moment passed, and Taras signaled to move. The final stretch was tense. The outpost came into view, a cluster of sandbags and concrete slabs, manned by a weary handful of defenders. As the unit approached, a low whistle cut the air, and Taras raised a fist. They dropped to the ground, hearts pounding, as the whistle grew into a shriek. A shell landed somewhere to the west, the ground trembling beneath them. Dust rained down, coating their faces. Mykola's hands shook, but he gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing with the weight of what lay ahead. They were here, at the edge of the storm, and there was no turning back. The first spark, the battle, begins. The outpost was a fragile bastion, its sandbags sagging under the weight of endless rain, its concrete walls scarred by shrapnel. Mykola's unit spread out, taking positions behind crumbling barriers and shattered windows. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and cordite, the faint buzz of drones a constant undercurrent. Dawn had given way to a grey morning, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press the world closer to the ground. Mykola crouched beside a broken wall, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the street ahead. The narrow lane, their lifeline, stretched into the haze, flanked by ruins that loomed like silent sentinels. Irina knelt nearby, her radio hissing as she relayed coordinates, her voice steady despite the tension etched into her face. Serhiy checked his medic's bag, his fingers moving with quiet precision, though his quick glance at Mykola betrayed a flicker of unease. Captain Taras moved among them, his voice low but firm, assigning sectors, checking weapons. "Hold the line," he said, his eyes meeting each soldier's. "Whatever comes, we hold." Mykola nodded, his throat tight, the photograph of Olena a steady weight against his chest. The first sign of trouble came with a distant rumble, not artillery but something closer, heavier. Taras raised his binoculars, his jaw tightening. "Vehicles," he whispered, and the unit stiffened. The fog had thinned, revealing the faint outline of shapes moving at the street's far end. Dark, angular forms, their engines growling like predators. Mykola's heart thudded, his grip on the rifle slick with sweat. Irina's radio crackled with urgent voices, reporting movement across the line. The enemy was probing, testing their defenses. Then, a sharp crack split the air. A sniper's shot from somewhere in the ruins. The soldier beside Mykola, a young recruit named Dmitro, flinched, his helmet grazing the wall. "Stay down!" Taras hissed, his hand pressing Dmitro's shoulder. The shot was a warning, a signal that the calm was over. Moments later, the rumble grew louder, and shadows resolved into armored vehicles, their turrets swiveling as they crept forward. Mykola's breath caught, his mind racing. The street was too narrow for a full assault, but that made it a choke point, perfect for an ambush, Taras signaled, and the unit braced. Irina whispered into her radio, calling for support, her voice a thread of calm in the rising storm. Mykola peered through a gap in the wall, his eyes locking on the lead vehicle. Its tracks churned the mud, its bulk filling the street. Then a flash, muzzle fire from the ruins opposite. Bullets pinged against the concrete, sending chips flying. Mykola ducked, his pulse roaring in his ears. Serhiy beside him muttered a curse, his hands already pulling bandages from his bag, anticipating the worst. The unit returned fire, their rifles barking in short, controlled bursts. Mykola aimed at the shadows, his shots precise, driven by instinct, honed over months. The enemy's advance slowed, but the pressure mounted. A second vehicle lurched forward, its cannon swiveling. Taras shouted orders, directing fire, his voice cutting through the chaos. Then, a jolt, a rocket streaked from the Ukrainian side, striking the lead vehicle. A fireball bloomed, its heat washing over the outpost. The unit cheered, but the moment was fleeting. Irina's radio fell silent, the line cut. She cursed softly, smacking the device, her fingers trembling as she tried to reconnect. Mykola glanced at her, seeing the strain in her eyes, but she waved him off, focused. The enemy regrouped, their fire intensifying, bullets stitching patterns across the walls. A sudden explosion rocked the outpost, a grenade landing too close. Dust choked the air, and Maindenza screamed, clutching his arm. Serhiy was on him in seconds, his hands moving with desperate speed, tying a tourniquet as blood seeped into the mud. Mykola's world narrowed to the street, the rifle, the next breath. He fired again, his mind a blur of fear and focus. Taras shouted for them to hold, but the enemy pressed closer, their shapes growing clearer through the smoke. A new sound joined the chaos, a low, mechanical whine. Drones. Mykola's stomach dropped. They were exposed, pinned. In that moment, a single thought burned through his fear. The street had to hold, for Olena, for the others, for the fragile hope they all carried. He reloaded, his hand steady now, and prepared for what came next. A choice in the fire. The sacrifice. The air was thick with smoke, curling like ghosts around the outpost as the battle raged. The narrow street, Bakhmut's fragile lifeline, pulsed with the chaos of gunfire and the relentless thud of artillery. Mykola's ears rang, the world reduced to flashes of light and shadow. The enemy's advance had stalled, their lead vehicle a smouldering wreck, but the pressure hadn't eased. Bullets snapped overhead, and the drone's mechanical whine grew louder, their red lights flickering through the haze like malevolent stars. The outpost was holding, but barely, its defenders stretched to their limits. Mykola crouched behind a shattered wall, his rifle hot in his hands, his breath shallow. Beside him, Serhiy worked on Dmytro, whose arm was bound tightly, his face pale but resolute. Irina, her radio still silent, had switched to a rifle, her movements sharp and deliberate as she fired into the ruins across the street. Captain Taras paced the line, his voice hoarse but steady, rallying the unit. "We hold here," he said, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed to defy the chaos. But Mykola saw the truth in the captain's taut shoulders. They were running out of time. The drones were the immediate threat. Their cameras swept the outpost, guiding the enemy's fire with deadly precision. One hovered too close, its hum piercing the din. Taras pointed to a soldier with a jamming device, but a burst of gunfire cut through, and the man fell, clutching his side. Serhiy scrambled to him, dragging him to cover. But the jammer lay useless in the mud. Mykola's heart sank. Without it, the drones would pick them apart, calling in strikes that could end them all. Then came the moment that would haunt Mykola. A new sound, a low, grinding roar, signaled another vehicle approaching, its silhouette looming through the smoke. It was heavier, armored, its cannon already swiveling toward their position. If it reached the street's mouth, their line would collapse. Taras shouted for anti-tank weapons, but their supply was spent, the last rocket used on the first vehicle. Mykola's mind raced, his eyes darting to the fallen jammer, then to the vehicle's path. There was one option, a desperate one, whispered in the unit's training. A soldier could disable a drone manually, but it meant crossing open ground, exposed to fire. Irina saw it too. Her eyes met Mykola's, a silent understanding passing between them. She was faster, smaller, more likely to slip through the chaos unnoticed. Before Mykola could speak, she dropped her rifle, grabbed the jammer, and sprinted toward a pile of rubble closer to the drone's path. Bullets kicked up dirt around her, but she moved with a grace born of necessity, her braid swinging as she dove into cover. Mykola's breath caught, his hands trembling as he fired to cover her, his shots wild but meant to draw attention. Irina reached the rubble, her fingers fumbling with the jammer's controls. The drone dipped lower, its lights fixed on her. Mykola shouted her name, his voice lost in the roar. Then, a flash, a grenade detonated nearby, its shockwave throwing Irina back. She hit the ground hard, the jammer slipping from her hands. Mykola froze, his heart a hammer in his chest. Serhiy started to move toward her, but Taras held him back, his face grim. The vehicle was closer now, its cannon firing, a shell exploding just beyond the outpost. The street was seconds from being lost. Mykola didn't think. He dropped his rifle, sprinted across the open ground, and slid beside Irina. Her eyes were open, dazed, a thin line of blood tracing her temple. "Go," she whispered, pushing the jammer toward him. He grabbed it, his hands shaking, and ran for the drone's path. Bullets whined past, one grazing his sleeve, but he kept moving, driven by a single thought. The line had to hold. For Olena, for Irina, for them all. He reached a shattered wall, activated the jammer, and aimed it skyward. The drone's hum faltered, its lights flickering as it veered off, crashing into a nearby building. The vehicle slowed, its crew disoriented without the drone's eyes. Taras seized the moment, rallying the unit to focus fire. The enemy advance faltered, then fell back, their shapes retreating into the smoke. Mykola stumbled back to Irina, helping her to cover. Serhiy was there, his hands quick, bandaging her wound. She managed a weak smile, her voice barely audible. "Stupid move, Mykola." He laughed, a shaky sound, relief flooding him. The street was theirs. For now, the silence aftermath. The gunfire faded, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. The street, scarred and littered with debris, lay quiet under a sky heavy with ash and clouds. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage of the enemy vehicle, its twisted metal glowing faintly in the dying light. The outpost stood, battered but intact, its sandbags slumped, its walls pocked with fresh scars. Mykola knelt beside Irina, his hand still trembling from the rush of adrenaline, the jammer discarded in the mud beside him. Her breathing was steady now, thanks to Serhi's quick work, but her face was pale, her eyes distant as she stared at the ruins, the unit gathered in the aftermath, their faces etched with exhaustion. Captain Taras moved among them, checking injuries, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Dimitro, his arm bandaged, sat against a wall, his gaze fixed on the ground. The soldier who'd fallen to the sniper's shot was alive, carried to a makeshift triage by Serhi, who worked with a quiet intensity, his hand stained with dirt and blood. The drones were gone, their threat silenced by Mykola's desperate run, but the cost lingered in the air. The street had held, but at what price? Mykola's eyes traced the wreckage. A single shoe, small and worn, lay half buried in the mud, a relic of a life that once passed through these streets. A shattered window reflected the grey sky, its jagged edges catching the last of the day's light like a broken mirror. The air smelled of burnt metal and damp earth, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. He reached into his jacket, touching the photograph of Olena, its edges soft from countless moments of comfort. The image grounded him, but it couldn't erase the weight of what he'd seen, Irina's fall, the grenade's flash, the moment he thought he'd lost her. Irina stirred, her voice weak but sharp. "You're an idiot, Mykola," she said, a faint smile breaking through her pain. He chuckled, the sound raw, and helped her sit up. Serhi, finishing his work on another wounded soldier, glanced over, his usual grin absent. "We're all idiots," he muttered, but his eyes held a flicker of pride. Taras approached, his face unreadable, and placed a hand on Mykola's shoulder. "You did good," he said simply, then turned to check the line. The words were spare, but they carried a weight that settled deep in Mykola's chest. The street was secure for now. Reinforcements would come, or so the radio promised when it flickered back to life. But the victory, if it could be called that, was fragile. The enemy would return, their shadows already lurking beyond the horizon. The unit knew it, felt it in the ache of their bodies, the hollow quiet that followed the fight. They had held the line, but the war stretched on, an endless tide eroding their strength. As dusk fell, Mykola sat with Irina and Serhi, sharing a moment of quiet. The sky was a bruise of purple and grey, the air cool against their sweat-damp skin. No one spoke of the fallen, not yet. Instead, they shared a ration bar, its taste bland, but comforting in its familiarity. Serhi hummed a fragment of a folk song, the notes soft, almost lost in the wind. Irina leaned against the wall, her sketchbook unopened in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges as if it held the sea she longed for. Mykola looked out at the street, its ruts and scars a testament to their stand, and felt a strange mix of emptiness and resolve. They had held, but the silence was heavy with what might come next. A letter unsent. Reflection. Night settled over Bakhmut, a heavy blanket pierced only by the faint glow of distant fires. The outpost was quiet now, its defenders huddled in small groups, their faces lit by the flicker of a single lantern. Mykola sat alone, his back against a cold concrete wall, the photograph of Olena in his hands. The creased image caught the light, her smile a stark contrast to the desolation around him. The street they had fought for lay still, its ruts and debris softened by darkness, but the weight of the day lingered in Mykola's chest, a quiet ache that refused to fade. He pulled a scrap of paper from his pack, its edges worn from being carried through weeks of mud and rain. A pencil, whittled to a stub, rested in his hand. He began to write, the words slow at first, each one a tether to the life he'd left behind. "Olena," he wrote, "I don't know if this will reach you. The days here are long and the nights longer. But I see you in every quiet moment, in the way the stars break through the smoke." He paused, his breath catching, the pencil hovering over the page. The words felt inadequate, too small for the vastness of what he carried. Fear, hope, the stubborn will to keep going. Mykola thought of Irina, her braid swinging as she ran toward danger, her weak smile after the fight. He thought of Serhii, whose hands never faltered, even when the world seemed to collapse. And he thought of the others, Dmitro, Taras, the soldier whose name he barely knew, now recovering in a makeshift cot. They were bound not by orders or ideals, but by something deeper, a shared resolve to protect what mattered, even when the cost was carved into their bones. The war was a storm, relentless and unyielding, but in its shadow, Mykola saw glimpses of humanity that refused to be extinguished. The bird that sang in the ruins, Serhii's hummed melody, Irina's sketchbook holding dreams of the sea. These were the threads that held them together. They were not heroes in the way stories told, but ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens. Mykola wrote on, his words a quiet rebellion against the chaos. "I fight for you, Olena, for the garden we planted, for the home we'll rebuild. I don't know if I'll see it, but I believe in it." He folded the letter, tucking it beside the photograph, unsure if it would ever leave his pocket. The act of writing was enough, a way to anchor himself to a world beyond the rubble. He looked out at the street, its scars hidden in the dark, and felt a flicker of something. Not peace, but a stubborn hope that tomorrow might bring them closer to it. The war would go on, but so would they, carrying their memories, their bonds, their reasons to hold the line. For those who hear this story, let it linger. What does it mean to stand firm when the world trembles? To carry love through fire? Share your thoughts below. What keeps us human in the face of such trials? Subscribe to Ukraine Frontline War Stories for more tales of courage and heart, stories that remind us of the light that endures even in the darkest of nights.